"Can you pretend to be my son's father?" the Black Widow whispered desperately to the giant cowboy, clutching her trembling child as church bells echoed her public humiliation. The frontier town had already marked her for ruin, a woman alone with a bastard child, destined for poverty and shame. They whispered Black Widow behind gloved hands, certain she'd buried a husband and now sought another fool to trap. But across the dusty street stood their gentle giant, a towering cowboy whose quiet strength masked his own shattered heart. What the widow didn't know was that her desperate proposal would unlock a $10,000 inheritance if she could prove herself a respectable married woman within 6 months. And what the cowboy didn't know was that her dead husband was very much alive, violent, and already tracking them down. Would their pretend family survive long enough to become real, or would the truth destroy them both? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The dust kicked up by the stagecoach settled around Etta Mae Blackwell as she stepped onto the wooden planks of Dusty Creek's main street. Her 3-year-old son, Jesse, clung to her worn brown dress, his wide eyes taking in the unfamiliar faces that turned to stare. She pulled her shawl tighter and walked toward the boarding house with measured steps. The whispers started immediately. Mrs. Henley from the general store leaned toward her neighbor. The blacksmith paused his hammering to watch her pass. Even the children playing in the street stopped their games to point. By the time Etta Mae reached the boarding house steps, the entire town had decided her story. Black Widow, husband dead, another mouth to feed and trouble to follow. Etta Mae signed the register with steady hands despite the trembling in her chest. The boarding house keeper, a thin woman with pinched features, looked her up and down twice before handing over the room key. The next 3 days passed in a blur of establishing routine. Etta Mae set up her sewing station by the window of their small room. Her nimble fingers worked magic with needle and thread, transforming torn fabric into beautiful garments. Word spread quickly about her skill. Soon, a steady stream of women climbed the boarding house stairs, carrying their mending and custom orders, but skill meant nothing without respect. The women paid her fairly, but spoke to her as if she were invisible. They discussed their lives, their families, their concerns as though she weren't sitting right there, creating beauty from their scraps. Jesse played quietly in the corner, his wooden horse the only toy they owned. Sunday morning arrived with uncomfortable weight. Etta Mae dressed Jesse in his cleanest shirt and brushed his hair until it shone. The walk to church felt like walking through a gauntlet. Eyes followed them. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Reverend Coates stood at the pulpit, his gray beard neatly trimmed, his black suit pressed. His eyes swept over the congregation and landed on Etta Mae and Jesse in the back pew. After the service, she approached him with careful steps. "Reverend, I'd like to have my son baptized." The Reverend's expression shifted. His gaze moved from Jesse's innocent face to Etta Mae's hopeful one. "Where is the child's father?" "He passed, sir. It's just us now." "I see." Reverend Coates clasped his hands behind his back. "Our church requires a father or godfather present for baptism. It's tradition. A child needs masculine guidance in his spiritual journey." Heat rose in Etta Mae's cheeks. Around them, other families chatted and laughed, making plans for Sunday dinner. Their children ran between the pews, carefree and accepted. "Surely you can make an exception. Jesse needs this blessing." "I'm sorry, but I cannot bend church doctrine. Find a suitable man to stand with you and we'll proceed." The rejection hit like a physical blow. Etta Mae took Jesse's hand and walked out of the church with her chin up, though her heart crumbled with each step. The congregation watched her exit. Some faces showed pity. Others showed satisfaction at seeing her put in her place. Outside, Jesse tugged on her dress. "Mama, why are we leaving? We'll come back another day, sweetheart." But as they walked down the church steps, Etta Mae wondered if that day would ever come. Without baptism, Jesse couldn't attend the town's school. Without education, his future looked as bleak as their present circumstances. That evening, as Jesse slept, Etta Mae sat by the window with her sewing. The lamplight flickered across a letter that had arrived that morning from back east. Her hands shook as she read it for the third time. Her Aunt Martha had died. The inheritance was substantial, $10,000 and a house in San Francisco. But there was a condition that made her heart race and sink simultaneously. She had to prove she was living as a respectable married woman with a family. $10,000, enough to give Jesse everything he deserved: education, opportunity, a real future. But she had 6 months to establish herself as a proper wife and mother, or the money would go to distant cousins who had never shown her kindness. The next morning brought another failed attempt at finding help. 3 different men turned down her request to stand as Jesse's godfather. One laughed outright. Another suggested she find herself a real husband instead of bothering decent folks. Desperation clawed at her chest. That's when she noticed him. Silas Boone stood outside the general store, loading supplies onto a wagon. He towered over other men, his broad shoulders straining against his work shirt. But it wasn't his size that caught her attention. It was the gentle way he helped an elderly woman with her packages, the patient smile he gave to children who gathered around him like he was some kind of gentle giant. She'd watched him for days now. He worked odd jobs around town, fixed broken things, never raised his voice or showed anger. When children approached him, his entire demeanor softened, but there was sadness in his eyes, the kind of sadness that came from loss too deep to heal. Etta Mae had seen that same sadness in her mirror every morning for months. The church bells began to ring, calling people to evening service. Families walked past in their Sunday clothes, fathers lifting children onto their shoulders, mothers straightening little dresses. Etta Mae made her decision. She walked across the dusty street, her heart hammering against her ribs. Silas looked up as she approached, his weathered face showing surprise at her bold approach. "Sir, I have a question that might sound strange." He waited, patient as mountains. "Can you pretend to be my son's father?" Silas Boone studied the woman standing before him. Her dark skin gleamed with perspiration from nerves, but her chin stayed level. Her little boy peeked out from behind her skirts, clutching a wooden horse. The question hung in the dusty air between them. Silas had been asked many things in his 34 years, asked to break wild horses, asked to move cattle across dangerous territory, asked to build barns and mend fences and fight fires, but no one had ever asked him to be a father again. The memory hit him like a lightning strike, Tommy's small hand in his. Sarah's laugh echoing through their cabin, the smell of smoke and the sound of screaming and the terrible silence that followed. 5 years since the fire took them. 5 years since he'd been anyone's protector. Yes. The word came out before he could stop it, before he could think of all the reasons to say no, before fear could take hold. Etta Mae's eyes widened. She'd clearly expected rejection, argument, maybe laughter, not immediate acceptance from a man who barely knew her name. Just like that? Just like that. Jesse stepped out from behind his mother's skirts. He tilted his head back to look up at Silas, his neck craning to take in the full height of the giant cowboy. "You're very big," Jesse said, with the honesty of 3-year-olds. Something cracked open in Silas's chest. Tommy had said the same thing the first time he'd really looked at his father, really seen how tall Papa was compared to everyone else. Silas crouched down, bringing himself closer to Jesse's eye level. "Big enough to keep you safe, little man." Jesse smiled, the same gap-toothed grin that haunted Silas's dreams. That night, Etta Mae explained everything: the inheritance, the condition, the 6 months they needed to maintain the pretense. She offered him half the money when it came through. Silas listened without interruption. When she finished, he had only one question. "What do I need to do?" The baptism was scheduled for the following Sunday. Word spread through Dusty Creek like wildfire. The Black Widow had found herself a man after all. And what a man. Silas Boone, the gentle giant who could tame any horse and build anything with his bare hands. Saturday evening, Etta Mae sat Jesse down for a conversation. "Tomorrow, Mr. Silas is going to stand with us at church. People are going to think he's your papa." "Is he my papa?" The innocent question cut deeper than Etta May expected. He's going to pretend to be. Like a game. Jessie considered this with the seriousness only children could muster. Will he stay? For a while, sweetheart, for a while. Sunday morning arrived bright and clear. Etta May dressed Jessie in his best clothes and brushed his hair until it shone. When Silas knocked on their boarding house door, she barely recognized him. He'd trimmed his beard, slicked back his hair, and wore a clean white shirt under his black vest. He looked like a proper father. The walk to church felt different this time. Instead of whispers and stares, people nodded respectfully. Mrs. Henley from the general store actually smiled. The blacksmith tipped his hat. Inside the church, Reverend Coates waited at the baptismal font. His expression showed surprise at seeing Silas Boone standing beside the Black Widow, but he recovered quickly. And you are? Silas Boone, Jessie's father. The lie came so easily it didn't sound like a lie at all. Silas placed a protective hand on Jessie's shoulder, and the boy leaned into him naturally. Reverend Coates began the ceremony. The words washed over them like a blessing. When he asked if Silas would guide the boy in Christian faith, Silas answered with conviction that surprised everyone, including himself. I will. Jessie giggled when the holy water touched his forehead. The sound echoed through the church like music. Several congregation members smiled despite themselves. But it was what happened next that changed everything. Jessie reached up toward Silas, his little arms extended. Without thinking, Silas lifted the boy, settling him against his chest with practiced ease. Jessie wrapped his arms around Silas's neck and whispered something that only the giant cowboy could hear. Thank you for being here, big man. The words hit Silas like a physical blow, not because they hurt, but because they healed something he'd thought was broken forever. His arms tightened protectively around the child, and for a moment he forgot this was all pretense. After the ceremony, they walked home as a family. Jessie skipped between them, chattering about the church bells and the pretty windows and how the water felt cold on his head. Other families nodded to them in passing. Normal, accepted. At the boarding house, Etta May put Jessie down for his nap. When she returned to the sitting room, she found Silas staring out the window, his jaw tight with emotion. You were good with him today. Natural. I had a son once. The words came out rough, like they'd been scraped from somewhere deep inside. Tommy. He'd be about Jessie's age now. Etta May waited. Pain recognized pain. House fire 5 years back. I was out checking cattle. Came home to find everything gone. He turned from the window, his eyes holding grief that matched her own. Been running from it ever since. I'm sorry. Maybe it's time I stopped running. That evening, lawyer Augustus Finch arrived on the late stage. A thin man in expensive clothes with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He took a room at the boarding house and made appointments to interview the family. The next morning, he sat across from them in the boarding house parlor. Jessie played quietly on the floor between Silas and Etta May, building towers with wooden blocks. How long have you been married? Finch asked, his pen poised over official papers. 6 months, Etta May answered smoothly. And the boy? Mine from before, Silas said. His voice carried absolute authority. But he's ours now. Finch made notes. He asked about their living arrangements, their plans, their commitment to family life. Silas answered each question with quiet confidence. When Jessie climbed into his lap halfway through the interview, Silas didn't miss a beat. He simply adjusted the boy's position and continued talking. Finch seemed satisfied. Before leaving, he shook both their hands. The inheritance should process within 4 months. You'll receive notification by mail when the funds transfer. After he left, Etta May sank into her chair. 4 months. We just need to keep this up for 4 months. But as she watched Silas help Jessie build a castle from blocks, she wondered if 4 months would be enough, or if it might be too much. The pretense was becoming easier each day, too easy, and that scared her more than failure ever could. Within a week, they'd moved into a small house on the edge of town, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a sitting room that caught the morning light perfectly. Etta May set up her sewing station by the front window. Silas took the smaller bedroom and gave Jessie the larger one. The arrangement felt natural. Too natural. Etta May's seamstress business flourished in ways it never had at the boarding house. Women came to their home now, bringing not just mending but custom orders for wedding dresses and Sunday clothes. They paid better rates and stayed longer, chatting about town gossip while she worked. What surprised her was how much they respected her skill. Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, examined every stitch of a dress Etta May had altered. Remarkable work. Where did you learn to sew like this? Necessity teaches fast. The truth behind those words ran deeper than Mrs. Patterson could imagine. Etta May had learned to sew during the darkest period of her marriage to Clayton, when his drinking got worse, when his fists got heavier. She'd needed a way to earn money quietly. Sewing became her escape plan, one perfect stitch at a time. She'd practiced until her fingers bled, studied pattern books by candlelight, taught herself embroidery and beadwork by unraveling expensive garments and figuring out their secrets. Every technique mastered was another step toward freedom, now that freedom was building into something she'd never expected. Security, respect, a future that didn't involve looking over her shoulder. Silas proved equally valuable around their new home. He repaired the sagging porch steps, fixed the leaky roof, and built shelves for Etta May's sewing supplies. His hands moved with practiced confidence, turning broken things whole again. Jessie followed him everywhere. The boy would sit cross-legged in the dirt, watching Silas work with the intensity of a student memorizing scripture. When Silas noticed the attention, he started explaining what he was doing. See how the wood grain runs? You always work with it, never against it. Why? Same reason you work with people instead of against them. Things last longer when they fit natural. The wisdom in his words surprised Etta May. This wasn't just a hired hand or a drifter. This was a man who understood how to build things that endured. One evening, she found them in the backyard. Silas had set up a workbench and was teaching Jessie to whittle. The boy's small hands gripped a piece of soft pine, while Silas guided the knife with careful movements. Slow and steady. Let the wood tell you where it wants to go. Jessie's face scrunched in concentration. Wood shavings curled away from his efforts, revealing the rough shape of a horse. Like my toy horse? Exactly like that. Watching them together stirred something dangerous in Etta May's chest, something that felt suspiciously like hope. That night after Jessie was asleep, she and Silas sat on the front porch. The desert air carried the scent of sage and distant rain. You're good with him. He makes it easy. Silas stretched his long legs out in front of him. Reminds me how simple things can be when you see them through a child's eyes. You mentioned your son before, Tommy. Silas was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief. Tommy was 4 when the fire started. Sarah was expecting another baby. I was out checking on a sick calf, maybe 2 miles from the house. He stared into the darkness beyond their porch light. Saw the smoke first, then the glow. By the time I got there, the roof had already collapsed. Etta May waited. Some stories needed space to breathe. Found their bodies in what used to be our bedroom. Sarah had tried to get Tommy out through the window, but the smoke got them first. His hands clenched into fists. If I'd been there, if I'd come back earlier. You can't carry that blame. Been carrying it for 5 years, getting pretty heavy. The honesty in his voice matched her own carefully guarded pain. She understood the weight of guilt, the endless loop of what-if thoughts that could drive a person mad. I married young, she said quietly. Thought I was getting protection and security. Instead, I got a man who drank too much and used his fists when words failed him. Silas turned to look at her. In the lamplight, she could see the understanding in his eyes. Took me 3 years to save enough money to run. Another year to find the courage. The day I left, Clayton was passed out drunk on the kitchen floor. I packed one bag, took Jesse, and walked 20 miles to the nearest town. That takes strength most people don't have. Desperation gives you strength you didn't know existed. They sat in comfortable silence after that. Two people who'd survived their own kinds of hell, finding unexpected peace in shared honesty. The peaceful routine lasted 3 weeks. Then Jesse got sick. It started with a cough. By evening, he was burning with fever. Etta May tried cool cloths and willow bark tea, but his temperature climbed higher. When he started struggling to breathe, panic set in. "We need the doctor. Dr. Hayes lives on the other side of town." Silas was already putting on his coat. "I'll carry him." In this storm? Rain had started an hour earlier, turning the roads to mud. Lightning split the sky with increasing frequency. He needs help now. Silas wrapped Jesse in blankets and lifted him carefully. The boy's head lolled against his shoulder, his breathing shallow and rapid. Etta May grabbed her shawl and followed them into the storm. The walk to Dr. Hayes's house should have taken 15 minutes. In the mud and driving rain, it took nearly an hour. Silas never faltered. He held Jesse like the most precious cargo, shielding him from the worst of the weather with his own body. Dr. Hayes took one look at Jesse and ushered them inside. For 2 hours they waited while he worked. Etta May paced the small sitting room. Silas sat motionless in a chair, his clothes still dripping, his face etched with worry that went deeper than pretense. Finally, Dr. Hayes emerged from the bedroom. "Pneumonia, but we caught it early. His fever's breaking. He should recover fully with rest." Relief flooded through Etta May like physical pain. She sank into the nearest chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. "Can we see him?" "Of course, but keep quiet. He needs sleep." Jesse looked impossibly small in the doctor's bed. His breathing was easier now, his color better. Etta May smoothed his hair while Silas stood beside her. Jesse's eyes fluttered open. He looked around the unfamiliar room, confusion clouding his fever-bright gaze. Then he saw Silas and smiled weakly. "Da?" The word hit both adults like lightning. Jesse had never called Silas that before. Always Big Man or Mr. Silas. But in his fevered state, with defenses down, the truth slipped out. "I'm here, son. You're going to be fine." Jesse's eyes drifted closed again, but his hand found Silas's and held tight. Outside the doctor's house, walking home through streets turned to rivers, neither of them spoke about what had happened. But everything had changed in that single word. The pretense was over. Now they were just a family trying to figure out how to stay together. Jesse recovered slowly over the next 2 weeks. Silas carved him wooden animals during the long afternoons when fever made the boy restless. A horse, a cow. A bear with careful details that showed hours of patient work. Each figure joined the growing menagerie on Jesse's windowsill. Etta May watched the ritual from her sewing station. The sight of Silas's large hands creating delicate toys stirred something warm and dangerous in her chest. This wasn't pretense anymore. This was a man who'd claimed them completely. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like coming home. Their peaceful routine shattered on a Tuesday morning when Clayton Blackwell stepped off the morning stage. Etta May didn't see him arrive. She was bent over Mrs. Henderson's wedding dress, adding pearl buttons with meticulous care when Jesse's wooden horse clattered to the floor. The boy stood frozen at the window, his face pale as milk. "Mama." The fear in his voice made her look up. Through the lace curtains, she saw a figure that turned her blood to ice water. Tall, lean, with dark hair slicked back and clothes that cost more than most people made in a month. Clayton had always been handsome in a sharp-edged way. It was part of what made him dangerous. "Jesse, go to your room. Close the door, and don't come out until I say." "But Mama." "Now!" Jesse ran. Etta May heard his bedroom door slam, just as Clayton knocked on the front door. 3 sharp raps that sounded like gunshots. She opened the door with steady hands despite the trembling in her chest. "Hello, wife." Clayton's smile hadn't changed, cold as winter morning, sweet as poisoned honey. He pushed past her into the sitting room without invitation, his eyes cataloging everything: the comfortable furniture, the thriving sewing business, the evidence of prosperity that hadn't existed when she'd belonged to him. "Nice little setup you have here. Very domestic." "What do you want, Clayton?" "What I've always wanted. My family back." He picked up one of Jesse's wooden animals, turning it over in his manicured hands. "Though I hear the boy's been calling another man daddy. That must sting." Fear and rage warred in Edame's chest. "Jesse doesn't remember you. You were drunk more often than sober when I left. But I'm sober now, clean as a Sunday shirt and twice as respectable." Clayton set the wooden horse down with deliberate care. "Been asking around town about your situation. Amazing what people will tell you when you buy them enough drinks." The threat in his voice was subtle but unmistakable. "You need to leave." "I don't think so. See, I had an interesting conversation with a lawyer fellow named Finch. Very chatty after a few whiskeys. Seems my dear wife is expecting a substantial inheritance. $10,000. Clayton's smile widened. That's quite a windfall for a runaway wife and her bastard child. The words hit like physical blows. Jesse isn't a bastard. He's your son. My son, raised by another man, living in another man's house, calling another man daddy. Clayton moved closer, his presence filling the small room like smoke. "Do you know what that makes you, darling? An adulteress. And do you know what that makes your inheritance claim? Fraudulent." Edame's mind raced. Clayton was right about the legal complexities. Married women couldn't inherit independently. Adultery could void inheritance claims. The careful structure she and Silas had built was cracking under the weight of legal reality. "What do you want?" "Half. My rightful share as your legal husband." Clayton straightened his already perfect cuffs. "I'll even let you keep playing house with your cowboy. Very modern of me. And if I refuse, then I expose your little charade. The fake marriage, the inheritance fraud, the adultery." Clayton's voice turned soft, which somehow made it more threatening. "I wonder how long it would take the law to sort through all those charges. Months, probably, maybe years. And what happens to Jesse while his mama sits in jail?" The sitting room felt smaller with each word. Edame could hear Jesse moving around in his bedroom, probably playing with his wooden animals, innocent of the adult world crashing down around him. "I need time to think." "Of course. Take all the time you need." Clayton moved toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Edame, don't think about running again. I found you once. I'll find you again. And next time, I might not be so generous with my terms." After he left, Edame sank into her chair. Her hands shook so violently she couldn't thread a needle. Everything they'd built, everything they'd hoped for, balanced on a knife's edge. When Silas came home that evening, he found her staring out the window at nothing. Jesse was already asleep, worn out by the day's tension. "What's wrong?" She told him everything. Clayton's arrival, the threats, the legal complications that could destroy them all. Silas listened without interruption, his face growing darker with each revelation. "So he's not dead. I never said he was dead. I let people assume. That's not what I meant." Silas sat across from her, his presence solid and reassuring despite the circumstances. "I meant he's not the kind of man who dies quietly in his sleep. He's the kind who comes back to haunt the living." The observation was more accurate than Edame wanted to admit. Clayton had always been a survivor, a schemer who landed on his feet no matter how far he fell. He wants half the inheritance, and if we give it to him, he disappears. Presumably. Edame rubbed her temples where a headache was building. But Clayton's promises have never been worth much. What's the alternative? Fight him, risk everything, probably lose. The options stretched before them like paths through a minefield. Each choice carried the potential for explosion. Silas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried absolute certainty. "Then we fight." "Silas, You don't understand what you're up against. Clayton is smart, ruthless, and he has the law on his side. Legally, I'm still his wife. Jesse is still his son. This house, this life, it's all built on lies. No. Silas leaned forward, his eyes intense. This house is built on love. That boy sleeping in there loves you more than anything in this world, and he trusts me to protect both of you. That's not a lie. Love doesn't stand up in court. Maybe not, but it's worth fighting for. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon. Lightning flickered in the distance, promising rain and chaos. Inside their small house, two people who'd found unexpected happiness prepared to fight for the right to keep it. The war for their family was about to begin. Clayton made his presence known throughout the week. He took meals at the hotel restaurant where everyone could see him. He bought drinks at the saloon and told carefully edited stories about his beloved wife, who'd suffered some kind of breakdown after childbirth. Poor woman had run off in confusion, taking their son. He'd been searching for them ever since. The story painted him as the devoted husband. Etta Mae became the unstable wife who'd abandoned her family. Jedediah Colton, the town's biggest gossip, soaked up every word. By Wednesday, half of Dusty Creek had heard Clayton's version of events. The other half heard it by Thursday. Etta Mae felt the shift immediately. Her sewing customers became scarce. Women who'd chatted freely now offered tight smiles and quick exits. Mrs. May Henderson canceled her order for the wedding dress without explanation. Only Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, spoke directly. "People are talking, dear, about your situation." "What situation is that?" "Your husband, your real husband. He seems like such a refined gentleman." Mrs. Patterson's tone carried careful judgment. It must be difficult for him, seeing another man raising his son. Etta Mae set down her needle. "Did he tell you why I left?" "He mentioned some troubles. Post-birth melancholy, perhaps. These things happen to new mothers sometimes." The lie was so smooth, so reasonable, that Etta Mae almost admired its construction. Clayton had always been gifted at twisting truth into whatever shape served his purpose. "I left because he beat me, regularly, when he was drunk, which was most nights." Mrs. Patterson's face went pale. "That's a very serious accusation. It's the truth." But truth without proof was just another story, and Clayton's story sounded more respectable to ears that wanted to believe the best of a well-dressed man with education and manners. Friday morning brought the confrontation everyone had been expecting. Etta Mae was hanging laundry when she heard the commotion from town. Raised voices, the sound of boots on wooden planks. Through the trees she could see a crowd gathering near the church. Jesse was playing in the backyard, building castles with wooden blocks. "Stay here, sweetheart. Don't leave this yard." She walked toward town with dread pooling in her stomach. The crowd had grown larger, forming a loose circle around two figures. Clayton stood in the center, his voice carrying clearly across the morning air. "I've been patient, more patient than any man should be expected to endure, but enough is enough." Silas faced him, calm as stone despite the tension radiating from every line of his body. Around them, the entire town seemed to have gathered. Men from the saloon, women with their shopping baskets, even children, wide-eyed and whispering. "My wife has been living in sin with this man," Clayton announced, his voice pitched to Carrie. "My son has been corrupted, taught to call another man father. This mockery of Christian decency ends today." Reverend Coates stepped forward. "Perhaps this should be handled privately." "No, this has gone on in public. It should be resolved in public." Clayton's performer's instincts were on full display. He knew how to work a crowd, how to make his cause seem righteous. "I demand my family return to me immediately." Murmurs rippled through the gathered townspeople. Some nodded agreement, others looked uncertain. All waited for Silas to respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried clearly in the morning air. "The lady doesn't want to go with you. The lady is my wife. What she wants is irrelevant." That's when something shifted in the crowd. Several women exchanged glances. Men who'd been nodding along with Clayton's speech suddenly looked less certain. Silas took one step forward. His size advantage became immediately apparent. Clayton was tall, but Silas towered over him like a mountain over a hill. She's not property. Neither is the boy. The law says otherwise. Then the law's wrong. The simple statement hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, the crowd grew restless. Some people began to back away, sensing the potential for violence. That's when Etta May made her choice. She walked into the center of the circle, her chin high despite the trembling in her hands. Every eye turned to her. Every ear strained to hear what she would say. "This man," she said, pointing at Clayton, "beat me for 3 years. He drank away our money. He threatened to kill me if I ever tried to leave." Gasps from the crowd. Clayton's face flushed red with anger. She's lying, hysterical. You can see how unstable she's become. Am I? Etta May pushed up the sleeves of her dress, revealing old scars on her arms, white lines where Clayton's rings had cut deep. A crooked finger that had healed wrong after he'd slammed it in a door. Are these lies too? The crowd went silent. Even Clayton seemed momentarily stunned by her boldness. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward from the crowd. Her face was pale but determined. "I've seen those scars. I noticed them when she was fitting my dress. I wondered but didn't want to pry." Other women began nodding. Scars told stories that refined manners couldn't hide. Dr. Hayes pushed through the crowd. "I treated similar injuries when I practiced back east, usually on women whose husbands had what they called drinking problems." Clayton's carefully constructed narrative began crumbling. His face twisted with the rage Etta May remembered so well. "You lying witch. I gave you everything. A home, a name, respectability. You gave me bruises and fear. I'll drag you back where you belong if I have to." Clayton stepped toward her, his hand raised. For a moment, the old fear paralyzed Etta May. 3 years of conditioning screamed at her to flinch, to cower, to submit. Instead, Silas stepped between them. The big cowboy didn't speak, didn't threaten, didn't even move aggressively. He simply stood there, solid as bedrock, between Clayton and the woman he'd claimed to protect. Clayton's hand slowly lowered. Even in his rage, he wasn't stupid enough to swing at a man who could break him in half. "This isn't over," Clayton snarled. "Yes, it is." Reverend Coates's voice carried unexpected authority. "I've heard enough. Mrs. Blackwell, you and your son are welcome in our church and our community. Mr. Boone, your protection of this family speaks well of your character." The crowd began to disperse, buzzing with conversation. Some people looked disappointed that no violence had occurred. Others seemed relieved that truth had won out over manipulation. Clayton stood alone in the empty street, his grand performance reduced to nothing. When he looked at Etta May, his eyes promised retribution. But for the first time in years, Etta May wasn't afraid. She had Silas beside her. She had the truth on her side. And she had a community that had chosen to believe her when it mattered most. The real fight was just beginning. Clayton left town on the evening stage, but not before making one final threat. He cornered Etta May outside the general store while Silas was loading supplies. "You think you've won? This isn't over. I'll be back with lawyers. Real lawyers who understand how the law works. Then we'll face them when they come." "We?" Clayton's laugh held no humor. "You think your cowboy will stick around when this gets ugly? When it gets expensive? Men like him don't fight legal battles. They run." But Clayton was wrong about men like Silas Boone. 2 weeks after Clayton's departure, a letter arrived from a law firm in Phoenix. Legal papers demanding Etta May's return to her lawful husband. Threats of criminal charges for abandonment and adultery. A court date set for the following month. Etta May read the papers twice, her hands shaking. The legal language was dense and intimidating, designed to overwhelm and frighten. It worked. "What does it mean?" Silas asked. "It means Clayton wasn't bluffing. He's hired real lawyers, good ones, from the look of this letterhead." That evening, they sat at their kitchen table planning their defense. The inheritance money hadn't arrived yet, so hiring their own lawyer seemed impossible. They had truth on their side, but truth without legal representation rarely won in court. "There's something else," Etta May said quietly. "Something I discovered when I was going through the inheritance paperwork more carefully." She pulled out the original letter from the lawyers handling her aunt's estate. The letter she'd read dozens of times but never examined in detail. "Look at this clause. The one about proving I'm a respectable married woman." Silas leaned over to read the fine print. His finger traced the legal text until he found the relevant passage. "If the beneficiary's marriage was obtained under duress or involved documented abuse, she may claim inheritance rights as a single woman, provided she can demonstrate her commitment to family and moral conduct." The words hung between them like a lifeline. "Your aunt knew," Silas said slowly. "She knew about Clayton. Aunt Martha was the only family member who ever questioned why I married so young. She visited once, right after Jesse was born. Clayton was on his best behavior, but she saw something that bothered her. The inheritance clause changed everything. If they could prove Clayton's abuse in court, Etta May could claim the money without him. But proof meant testimony, witnesses, exposing private shame in public forums. "Are you strong enough for that fight?" Etta May thought of Jesse, sleeping peacefully in his room. Of the wooden animals Silas carved for him, of the life they'd built together in their small house. "I'm strong enough." The court hearing took place in Phoenix on a sweltering Tuesday in September. Judge William Morrison presided, a stern man with gray hair and skeptical eyes. Clayton sat with two expensive lawyers looking confident and respectable in his finest suit. Etta May and Silas sat alone at the defendant's table. They couldn't afford legal representation, so Silas would speak for them both. The night before, he'd stayed up practicing his testimony by lamplight, his weathered hands turning pages of law books borrowed from the Phoenix Library. Clayton's lawyers presented their case first: marriage certificates, property documents, character witnesses who testified to Clayton's standing in his community back east. They painted a picture of a devoted husband wronged by an unstable wife who'd stolen his child and committed adultery. When they called Clayton to testify, he played his role perfectly: the grieving husband, the concerned father, the Christian gentleman seeking only to reunite his family. "Your Honor, I've made mistakes. I admit that freely. There were times when drink got the better of me, but I've reformed completely. I'm sober now, gainfully employed, and desperate to make amends to my family." It was a masterful performance. Even Etta May felt a flicker of doubt watching him. This was the man she'd fallen in love with at 17. Charming, articulate, seemingly sincere. Then Silas stood to present their defense. He wasn't a lawyer, didn't have formal education or legal training. But he had something Clayton's expensive attorneys lacked: absolute moral clarity. "Your Honor, I've known Etta May Blackwell for 6 months. In that time, I've seen her raise a son with patience and love. I've watched her build a business through skill and hard work. I've witnessed her courage in the face of threats and intimidation." Silas's voice carried the authority of a man who'd spent years leading cattle drives, making life and death decisions, earning respect through action rather than words. "But more than that, I've seen the scars." He called Dr. Hayes to testify about Etta May's injuries. Mrs. Patterson described the marks she'd noticed during dress fittings. 3 other women from Dusty Creek spoke about suspicious injuries they'd observed over the months. The evidence mounted like stones in a wall: crooked fingers, faded bruises, scars that told stories of systematic abuse. When Etta May took the stand, she spoke with quiet dignity about 3 years of terror. No dramatics, no appeals for sympathy, just facts delivered with the precision of a seamstress describing her work. Clayton's lawyers tried to discredit her testimony, but the physical evidence was undeniable. Scars don't lie. The final witness surprised everyone, including Etta May. Lawyer Augustus Finch took the stand and produced a letter he'd received from Aunt Martha before her death. A letter explaining exactly why the inheritance clause about abusive marriages had been included. Miss Martha Whitmore was very specific about her concerns regarding her niece's marriage. She witnessed suspicious injuries during a visit and wanted to ensure that if abuse was occurring, her inheritance would provide an escape route. Judge Morrison deliberated for less than an hour. The evidence of systematic abuse is overwhelming and undisputed. Mrs. Blackwell's marriage was obtained through her youth and maintained through fear and violence. The inheritance clause clearly applies. Clayton's confident expression crumbled. His lawyers shuffled papers and whispered urgently in his ear. Furthermore, Judge Morrison continued, given Mr. Blackwell's documented history of violence and threats, this court grants Mrs. Blackwell full custody of the minor child and orders Mr. Blackwell to cease all contact with both parties. Outside the courthouse, Silas and Etta Mae stood in the Arizona sun, officially free. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we go home. To our son. To our life." The inheritance arrived 2 weeks later, $10,000 and a house deed in San Francisco, more money than either of them had ever imagined possessing. They chose to stay in Dusty Creek. With the inheritance money, they bought a larger house on the edge of town. Silas used part of the funds to purchase a small ranch where he could raise horses. Etta Mae expanded her seamstress business into a proper shop, but the most important purchase they made was a simple gold ring from the general store. Reverend Coates performed the ceremony on a Sunday afternoon in October. Jesse served as ring bearer, his gap-toothed grin lighting up the church. The entire town attended, including Mrs. Patterson and Dr. Hayes, and even the formerly gossipy Jedediah Colton. When the Reverend asked if Silas would take Jesse as his own son, his answer echoed through the church, "I already have." As they walked out of the church together, Jesse tugged on Silas's coat. "Papa, are we really a family now?" "We've been a family since the day I met you, son. Now we just have the papers to prove it." 6 months later, Etta Mae gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah, after Silas's first wife. Jesse appointed himself the baby's protector, carving her a tiny wooden rattle with Silas's patient guidance. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the desert wind whispered through the sage, Etta Mae would find Silas on their front porch, whittling by lamplight. "What are you making now?" "Horses for Jesse's birthday, a whole herd of them." She settled beside him, her sewing in her lap, content in the rhythm of their shared work. Two people who'd lost everything had found their way to each other through a desperate question and a simple answer. The pretense that had brought them together had become the foundation of something real, something that would last.